Hello and welcome to Working with Miniatures. I'm Jim and today it's more hot and humid than the devil's ass crack. And I'm still sick. I don't even remember why I came out here. What am I doing? Whatever it is, let's get it done. I lay the Proxxon cutter on a large flat surface and measure the length, width, and height. From this I decide on these measurements. I make my measurements on plywood. I'll be making most of the cuts using a skill saw with a 5-foot level clamped in place, tacked as a guide. When using this guide, keep in mind the blade isn't flush with the edge of the skill saw. In my case, the offset is 1 7/16 inches. I mark a scrap stick with this distance so I can quickly make these adjustments on the fly. I also need to keep in mind which side of the line I'm cutting. The blade is 1 1/8 inches thick, so if I were to cut on the same side I measured, it would end up 1 1/8 inches too short. Other tips are to adjust the depth of your blade so it cuts just deep enough and not any deeper. And always check below what you're about to cut to ensure you do not cut into your table. You should also make sure you're supporting both sides of what you're cutting. Typically with sawhorses, you shouldn't be holding it with your hand like I'm doing here. This is just stupid. To cut the L, I measure out what I need to remove and then return to the skill saw. On the skill saw, I rough cut all the pieces that will make up the sides, and then I use the table saw to cut them to length. Even with the table saw as small as this one, it's still easier and quicker to make cuts like this than it is with the skill saw. With everything cut, I glue and clamp everything together as well as hit it with the nail gun for extra adhesion. Then I wait 24 hours for the adhesive to cure. The following day, utter horror. I glued the top board to the bottom of the frame. It should match the same orientation in the drawing. I decided against trying to pry it apart, as being pressed plywood it would irreparably damage it when I tried to separate the pieces, so I just tried it as it was. Thankfully, it still worked. The only drawback now is I would have to adjust the heat and turn it on before putting the Proxxon cutter in place. I push forward and begin to cut a channel to match the Proxxons for the guide, marking it with a pencil. I measure the depth of the channel and set the depth with my skill saw to match. This channel is significantly wider than the 1/8 inch blade of the skill saw, so I'll need to make 2 cuts, one along both edges of the channel, remembering to keep my blade on the correct side of the drawn line. With a Craig jig attached, I make my first pass. I didn't use this jig when I made my original cuts on the larger sheet of plywood because generally you have to have 2 hands to ensure you cut a straight line with this jig. And you should probably not use a mechanics cart as your work table, as you can see it's slowly moving away as I push the skill saw. With the 2 passes of my channel made, I have several options here. I can readjust the skill saw and use that, or I could use a router, or I could just use a chisel and hammer. Since plywood is just compressed layers of wood, the chisel removes these separate layers cleanly. I make a pass with a wood file to smooth anything that might catch the guide as it slides through the channel, and then we're done. Here's a sample cut being made with this wooden table extension. Originally I didn't intend on building out a foam extension table, but I have always kept in the back of my mind that not everybody has the tools I'm lucky enough to have. To be clear, my immediate thought though was a foam table's not going to be sturdy enough nor weigh enough, and as I push foam across it, surely the friction will just push the table itself away. Let's see if my assumptions were right. I'm using 1-inch XPS foams, so I begin cutting the sides and remembering to take into account that the top itself will also be 1 inch tall. The height is incredibly important here, more so than the width and length. If you mess up the width and length, it won't affect the effectiveness of the table, but the height will cause the foam to stick or catch. The top will be made out of scrap pieces of XPS foam, as I didn't intend to do this in the first place. So I cut one piece as long as the table, and then I cut a second piece as wide as the table, including the previous piece I had just cut. With everything cut, I began assembling the table, and I'm going to be honest here, I was still sick and hot and sweaty, and I didn't bother going in to grab my regular PVA glue, so I just used wood glue. I kind of felt like I was copping out on this foam table and only assuring its failure, and to add to my sloth, I also didn't go in to grab wooden skewers or toothpicks that I would normally use to help pin large pieces of foam together while the glue dried. Instead, I lazily shoved framing nails into the foam with my thumb just to pin it together. I then tossed some scrap wood on top to act as a weight, and I 100% expected that I'd be out here the next day sanding the wood glue off as best as I could and using my regular PVA glue to try and salvage this. The next day arrived and I anxiously ran, and by ran I mean I slowly hobbled my wheezing sick old man body out through the inferno of the Georgia day, and my first thought was, damn it, I glued the top board on upside down. I was supposed to hide the damage on this. Despite that mistake, and to my surprise, the foam table is surprisingly sturdy and it didn't fall apart. I still expected the friction from pushing foam across the top would in turn push the table extension away from the cutter, so I started with a small piece and see what would happen. The table stayed in place, so far so good, so let's try something longer. Okay, but what happens if I start dragging a fresh uncut 2x2 board over it, and not in a gentle fashion? To my astonishment, it didn't budge at all. It actually worked fine. The upside to the foam table is that it's a lot cheaper and lighter to move. It's also ridiculously easy to make. We're talking about less than 45 minutes worth of work, not including drying time for the glue. And all I needed was a decent table to work on, some rulers, two 2-foot by 2-foot by 1-inch thick XPS foam, and the Proxxon cutter. The downside is that the guide arm locks into place by a piece of metal that expands outwards as you tighten it, and the foam is malleable. Even if I were to cut a channel out for the guide to slide across, it would damage very easily and you wouldn't be able to lock the guide into the foam. I could cut out an insert from scrap wood and then gouge a recess and glue it into place, but the whole point of this foam table was to avoid additional tools, especially woodworking tools. Once my shop is further along, I'll build this into a permanent workbench. I'd like to strip the parts from the Proxxon Hotwire Cutter and build a complete custom table. The wire will be fed by a wall-mounted arm that is not attached to the body of the table, though I'll keep a ground wire between the head and the base. That's a long time away, however. Yet another project for yet another day. That's going to wrap it up for today. I hope you learned something or were inspired to modify your own Proxxon Hotwire Cutter. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. And if you like the content of this video and would like to see more, please like, share, and subscribe. I'm Jim with Working with Miniatures. I'm truly grateful for your time, and I bid you a fond farewell. Until the next video, where I'm hopefully not sick anymore.